Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Barry. I am the Vice President for Visitor Engagement and Chief Museum Curator at Selby Gardens. Thank you for joining us today for this special lecture by my colleague, John McCarthy, Historic Spanish Point. I just want to give a very brief introduction to John and then step aside, and I'm excited to hear him talk about his collection and his experience in amassing it of works by the Florida Highwaymen. John is a Florida native with a great knowledge of Florida history. I've already benefited from that knowledge in our time working together. John has 30 plus years of experience working in natural resources and parks and recreation. And he joined the Selby team with the adoption of the historic Spanish Point campus back in May of 2020. John is a major collector of paintings by the Florida Highwaymen, many of which we'll see in the presentation today. And I am grateful to John because he was instrumental in connecting Selby Gardens with the lenders who have contributed to the We Dream a World exhibition, which is currently on in the Museum of Botany and the Arts and will run until September 26th of 2021. So if you haven't already seen the show, please come by for a visit. And if you have, come back and see it in a new light with the information that John has shared today. So John, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Barry. I much appreciate the introduction. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Romanecki, our president and CEO of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. Several months ago, she asked me if I'd be willing to share my story for our members and friends. And so that's why we're here today. And Jennifer, I very much appreciate that. Like many things, I don't scratch the surface, I dig deep. And so hopefully folks will benefit from some of the things that my wife and I have learned in our almost 2 decades of seeking out and collecting these African-American artists' paintings of the Florida landscape. I'd also like to do a little shout out to Anya and Samantha and Miles, our Smithsonian Institute interns that have been working with us all summer. And their topic was scholarship on the Highwaymen artists. And so I actually learned some things from them that kind of caused me to look at some of the paintings with a new lens. And so we're all in this learning process to understand this amazing form of Florida art. So let's move on with the program. I have segmented the program today into 3 segments, one called Nature Inspires Art, one called Collector Gone Wild, and it really should be Collectors Gone Wild because this has all been teamwork with my wife and I, and then something called Immersed in Oil, which is kind of how we dug in and started researching and learning more, and some of the things that we learned that we thought would be of interest to folks coming to see the exhibit and those who are more interested in the Highwaymen. We're going to be taking your questions via chat, and in between each of these segments, we'll have some time for some questions and answers as we will at the end. So thanks again for being here. Nature Inspires Art. Clearly, it was the Florida landscape that inspired these young African Americans to begin to paint the scenes around them. And this is largely an East Coast phenomenon erupting out of Fort Pierce and Gifford to the north. And yet for me, it's, I'm a West Coast guy. Now, I grew up on a semi-tropical island about 100 miles south of here, spent the first 7 years of my life surrounded by nature. My mom took us to the beach every day, which was right out the front door. And my dad took us out to the mangroves and exploring the back bay, which was right out the back door. So I was kind of surrounded by nature. We had hibiscus blooms in the, hibiscus bushes in the front yard. We used to pick them and suck the nectar out. And of course, the only tree that really flowered was the Royal Point sienna. And so I grew up around all these images. And this particular image reminds me so much of kind of the view from the end of the little waterway that we lived on this island. And this island was paradise, folks. This was everybody knew everybody else. And it was really more nature than anything else. But this image just reminds me so much of my own childhood, of going out in the canoe, out into the expansive back bay, never knowing what you were going to discover. Now, my mom says that within maybe 3 days of me being home from the hospital, she took me to the beach, and the beach was where our world was. And so these Highwaymen images of beaches and palm trees are so iconic. And for me, I'm a native. Now, my wife, she grew up in Washington, D.C., but she came down to Florida chasing the same thing that my parents were chasing one generation before, beaches and palm trees. So you have to imagine for my wife to see a painting like this capturing the essence of what drew her to Florida in the first place is one of the things that kind of got us interested in these artists. And you'll see these same scenes again and again and again by the different artists. Some are in the morning, some are in the evening. The colors change, the styles change. In fact, same scene, but a little more cartoonish. This particular painting by Alfred Hare, painting very quickly so he could make several paintings and many dollars by selling the several paintings. And as you look at Highwayman art, you see again and again these images, but maybe it's, you know, a different color, a different tone. And it kind of reminds me of Claude Monet's Wheat Stacks, where he was painting these objects that were right in front of him all the time outside of his studio door, and yet he painted them in the morning light and the evening light and the moonlight, and the Highwaymen were doing the same thing. Now over here on the West Coast, we have Sarasota Bay and Roberts Bay and Little Sarasota Bay. Over on the East Coast, they have what they call the Indian River Lagoon. And again, images showing the Indian River Lagoon to me are just so much like Sarasota Bay. And here you got the iconic coconut palm, nothing more Florida than a coconut palm in people's minds, the tourists and the visitors that came here. Coconut palms and the beach and Florida were all the same, but these bayfront scenes are just amazing. And, you know, on the East Coast, they have A1A running from Key West all the way to Maine. And this road runs right along the waterfront. And so the docks and the boathouses that were depicted by these artists, I mean, to me, the only thing like this in Sarasota is like Bayshore Drive up by Indian Beach Road. So I try to transpose these scenes from the East Coast over here to the West Coast, because that brings it home for me. But these scenes are just so iconic of Florida. You just can't help but fall in love with them. And again, the different colors, the different times of day. And then, you know, you start to look at the work and you see just some very wide gray brushwork on the right-hand side that becomes in our minds Spanish moss, you know, an epiphyte. And then the palm tree, just a few little strokes of the palette knife, and you've got the palm fronds, a little bit of fast grass in front. This is the kind of scene that you would have seen driving down the road as a tourist. You don't have the air conditioner on in your car. You don't even have air conditioning in your car. You got the windows down, the breeze is coming in. You're falling in love with Florida. You're seeing these scenes right out the window of your car. You go across a river and this unfolds and you see the marsh. Just drive down 41 to the Myakka River and you can see almost this identical scene here on the West Coast. But this is likely the St. Lucie River over on the East Coast, a favorite subject of these artists. And they all painted it a little differently and in different times with different tones, but you see the expansive marsh, the woodlands in the background, the wonderful live oaks, the cabbage palms. If you're lucky, there's a little bird in the painting, and the wonderful clouds. But again, these are the scenes that you would see literally driving down the road. And when my parents took me out across the Everglades and you're cruising along the little canals on the side that actually built the road, and you look out and you see these tree islands out in the glades, and it just makes you want to get out and march on over there and find out what's in there, just to be there in the shade of that little tree island. This particular image by James Gibson is actually one of the very first paintings that my wife and I acquired. And for me, this represented the Carlton Reserve, where I was working back in the early 1990s, and where we had all these marshes and tree islands. But for James Gibson, this was just outside his back door in Fort Pierce. And again, scenes of pine trees and cypress trees and painted in different styles. That last one that we saw by James Gibson, he painted it a little slower. That was a modern painting, that's on canvas. Whereas this is an Alfred Hare on Upson board, painted fast, so he could make a fast buck and paint some more paintings. And then the iconic Royal Point Sienna. And people have asked me, John, why did the artist paint the Royal Point Sienna so much? Well, back in the 50s and 60s in Florida, you didn't have all the trees we have now. You didn't have so many jacarandas and golden rain trees. but you had the Royal Point sienna, and they were everywhere. And if you were in Fort Myers or in Miami or any of these areas, you would see these trees just littering the ground, creating a red carpet. Now, as my wife and I began to collect the paintings, of course, we're talking to gallery owners, we're talking to the artists. We learned about how some of this came about, how these artists had natural talent. Roy McClendon would draw pictures in the sand with a stick. Livingston Roberts' sister talks about him always painting. Alfred Hare's family, he was always painting. Harold Newton, he was always painting from when he was a child. They had natural talent, but that talent was observed by a woman named Zenobia Jefferson. And Radia Harper, our curator, has told you about this in the exhibit. So when you come and see it, you can learn a little bit more about Zenobia Jefferson, who connected some of the artists with another local artist named Bean Bacchus. And our Smithsonian interns doing research this summer found out some interesting things about how Bean Bacchus's uncle had paid for him to take art classes. It's what's now Parsons School of Design. But he was largely self-taught as well and became the preeminent landscape artist in Florida. And he helped inspire Harold Newton's work to shift from religious painting to landscapes. And he helped to perfect Alfred Hare's work as well. In fact, Alfred took lessons from him as a result of the connection with Zenobia. And you know, Bean Bacchus was kind of an interesting guy because this is 1950s Florida. It's very, very segregated. And yet here's a photograph that we obtained from the Bacchus Museum. Again, Miles, our intern, doing some research there. And it shows Patsy and Bean in the background. Patsy was Bean's wife. And then the Bacchus brats, as they were called, whoever was hanging out at his home and gallery at the time. And you can see this is a multicultural photo in a very segregated era. So, for instance, in Florida at this time, if you were African-American, you wanted to go to Silver Springs and go on the glass bottom boat, you could not. But there was Paradise Park. They would take your money and bring you in the back door. You had your own glass bottom boat and you could hang out at Paradise Park as you see the billboard here. The top image shows a beach weighed in Fort Lauderdale. This is when African-Americans began to assert their right to Florida beaches, because before that, they really were not welcome on the beach. The same thing happened in Sarasota. In fact, the protests that were out at Lido occurred before Rosa Parks took a stand on the school bus. And so Florida was at the heart of the civil rights movement. And you see the images here to tell you that these African-American artists did not have it easy out of the gate. You know, they were doing something that was very different than most of their colleagues. And so we're going to pause for a moment and see if Caitlin Whitaker, who's helping me out with the questions, has received any questions from our audience yet today.
You turn on my Hi,
All
John.
right. Hi, Caitlin.
Yes, it looks like we do have our first question. So our first question is, it was a common belief at the time that the highwaymen all worked on each other's paintings. For example, one would do the palm trees and another work on the ocean. And is that accurate?
Well, I think it's difficult to really pigeonhole all these artists and call them highwaymen. And if folks don't know this already, you should well know that this is not a name they selected for themselves. This is a name that an art critic assigned to them in 1994. Prior to that, they were just artists doing their thing. But there were different styles. So for instance, Harold Newton, he painted on his own. And he wasn't focused on fast painting. He was focused on very high quality painting. His brother Sam, very similar, painting on his own. There are stories of Alfred Hare teaching other people how to paint, and he'd have them do some of the background, and then he'd come along and hit the details. One of those people that apparently helped him out was his wife. And there were events, parties, if you will. They, have a little food, drink a little beer, do some painting, and paint multiple paintings at one time. But that was not the case for all of them. So some of these stories that are out there are true, but they're not universally true. And like most things, there's nothing simple about these artists. They each had their own style. They each kind of came to it in their own way. And I think that's one of the unique things about the art. It's all part of a genre, but it's very unique to the artist, and we should think of them as individuals, not as a collective. And so I think that's the best way to look at it.
Thanks, John. And we do have another couple questions. How did the highwaymen get their paint?
So they used oil paint almost exclusively. Some of them got their paint from Bacchus to get started. but they probably were able to buy that at a paint store, even though their work was not welcome in galleries. I'm sure that someone would take their money and sell them oil paint. And we'll talk about some of the other aspects, the materials that they used later on in another segment.
Wonderful. And then another question we have is, who is the art critic who gave them the highwayman designation?
Right, so his name is Jim Fitch, and he writes for a little publication called Florida Arts and Antiques. And if anyone ever goes antique shopping, you've probably picked up this little book. It's about 5 inches by 8 inches. And it was within those pages that he first kind of rolled out the name Highwayman. And over the years, he's done a number of articles in that publication featuring the art and encouraging people to go out and explore it, fall in love with it, and of course, purchase it and collect it.
Wonderful. And then how many female artists were there?
So Gary Monroe is who wrote a book about the Florida Highwaymen and really did the research along with Jim Fitch. And he put together a list of 26 artists, which then were all nominated to the Hall of Fame, the Artist Hall of Fame in Florida. And only one female was nominated, and that was Mary Ann Carroll. And some of Mary Ann Carroll's very fine work is on exhibit at Selby now. But I think that there was also Alfred Hare's wife, who apparently helped out a little bit. So again, the story's richer and deeper and many, many things to explore, not as cut and dried as people would have you believe.
Thanks, John. And then I think we do have some more questions coming in, but maybe we'll save those for the next segment.
Okay, let's do that. Let's go ahead and move on, because this one's entitled Collector Gone Wild. And again, this is me at the beach, where I spent all my time until I was 7 years old. And, you know, just inspired by nature. This is the Florida that I grew up in. On the one hand, Florida in the early 1960s was still largely undeveloped. On the other hand, some of the greatest technologists in the world are working at NASA to put man on the moon. So Florida was quite a dichotomy. Truly a tourist state. Everybody wanted to come to paradise. And so postcards of palm trees and sunsets and alligators and welcome to Florida. You know, these were kind of the tourist souvenirs, the things that reminded people of where they'd been, and they'd send back to their friends up north in the cold and make them jealous. And this is, within these walls is where I saw my first Highwayman paintings. And this is Gas Plant Antique Arcade up in St. Petersburg. I think my wife and I went there on our second date. And this was 3 stories, and at the top floor, it was all furniture, but there were all these colorful paintings hanging around the top of the ceiling, kind of out of reach, not easy to see, but maybe 50 of them when I first saw them. Yellow and orange and bright purple and all these different colors. And there are all these palm trees and river scenes and beach scenes. And I'm just looking at this stuff saying, I think these are those African-American artists that I'd heard about. And so I got thinking about it, but what was funny was that I thought these artists were here in Florida in the 20s and 30s, and that they were all long gone. Anyway, after a while, you know, the allure of these paintings caused my wife and I to go back. And when we were in a position to actually acquire 1 or 2, this is where we acquired our first paintings. And this is one of the first paintings that we purchased. Livingston Roberts. It had a little tag on it that said, Livingston really poured his heart and soul into this painting. And I love it because it's the beach where I grew up, the beach where I spent the first years of my life. Michelle loves it because this is what brought her to Florida in the first place, beach and palm trees. So nothing is more iconic about Florida. You see the pink sunset. You know, for the Highwaymen, it was a pink sunrise, right? East Coast, it's a sunset for us over here. And, you know, this is before navigation. We started collecting this art back in, you know, the early 2000 era. And so I would draw these maps the night before so that I knew where I was going, because we would have found paintings online that we wanted to see at the Bacchus Gallery or up at Grant Antique Shop or at Cody's Bamboo Gallery right there in Fort Pierce. And so I figured out by 10, Fort Pierce by 11 o'clock. We wanted to go up to Grant another hour or so. and then 3 to 5 hours, to get back home. And you're driving down the road. Oh, excuse me. You're driving down the road across the state on State Road 70, and you're going across these little rivers and you're seeing the scenes, and you're looking out at the pasture lands and you're seeing the palm trees. You're literally seeing some of the same scenes you're going to see when you get over to the East Coast and you start looking at all the paintings. And so this is like a different kind of highwayman, where you're filling up your car with gas, you're driving around, not to sell paintings, but to purchase them. And this is a photograph I took on the first day, I think, that I ever met a Florida highwayman, these guys who I thought were long gone, but instead they're right here in our midst. And again, this is a photograph from 20 years ago. This is Willie Daniels at Grant Antique Shop. And a woman came with a painting that her parents had purchased from Willie years ago, but it was not signed. And so she cut a deal with Willie he would sign the painting for $50. And I stood there and watched him. He spent about 20 minutes mixing his paint on his little palette with his little palette knife, and then deftly putting his name on the painting. Hey, she got her money's worth, She probably doubled the value of the painting because it went from unsigned to being signed. And he didn't just do it quick. He spent more time signing this painting than he had probably spent creating the painting in the first place. But Willie was just sitting here talking to us, mixing his paint, taking his time, see a smile on his face. He was happy to be there. This is a photograph that my wife took of Roy McClendon and I. Roy, just such a gentleman, such a kind person, always willing to stop what he was doing. He was always painting at the shows, and he'd stop and he'd talk to you and answer your questions as best he could. You tried to run a balance between asking too many questions and just admiring the art. But you see, he's signing a book. That's Gary Monroe's book, Story of the Highwayman. And everybody bought the book, for 29 bucks. Then you'd walk around and get all the artists to sign it. And then you'd see the art, and then you'd start looking at the prices, and then you'd say, should I buy that or not? And then usually by the end of the day, a few of these things behind you there on the wall would go home with you. And if they didn't go home that day, you'd be haunted by them for a week or two, and then you'd drive all the way back on the East Coast and pick up the paintings. This is another photograph of Roy and I, and this is, for him, this would have been a moonrise on the Atlantic Ocean. For my wife and I, who did nighttime turtle patrol on Casperson Beach for 20 years, this is like moon set on Casperson Beach. This is an old painting that Roy had done many years before. And this was kind of an interesting moment for Michelle and I, because we realized that, we were buying these old paintings from the galleries and stuff, but the artists weren't making any money off of that. And we wanted to buy art and support them because they were still, making art, and that's what they were doing for a living. So we started converting from old paintings on Upson board to new paintings on canvas, and purchasing paintings not for future value at all, but for our love of the images themselves and how they put a smile on our face and brought the outdoors inside our home. I'll point out in this particular image, I think it's interesting, James Gibson is shown in the middle there, all dressed up, always wearing a suit and tie at these events, always bragging about being in the Hall of Fame. And James had an extra distinction that Governor Jeb Bush had appointed him artist ambassador for the state of Florida. So he had a special medallion that he would wear. But if you look at him here, he's in full salesman mode. The woman that he's chatting with has a huge smile on her face because she loves whatever painting they're looking at. And James is happy too, because she's probably going to go home with that nice painting, and James is going to go home with a wad of cash. And you see, this is Grant Antique Mall. You see all the paintings up on the wall, and you'll even see how they have Upson on there to let you know that is an older painting. And we'll talk more about Upson board a little later. This is just another photograph, a different day, Roy McClendon and Johnny Daniels. Johnny came one day, Willie and Johnny, they're both brothers, came, and that was a big deal because I don't know that they had come out to a show together before. And so everybody was making a big deal that both of them were going to be there. And I ended up buying a nice little painting from Johnny that day and hanging out and chatting with him a little bit. This is an interesting photograph, and I'm so glad that Michelle took these photographs because, number one, it reminds me of before my beard went gray. So, we're looking at 15, 20 years ago here. And Isaac Knight went on to a career with Grumman Aerospace. worked there and supported the work at NASA, but he never really stopped painting. He'd work all day and go home and paint at night, but it wasn't like he was doing it for a living then. He was doing it for fun. If you look at his shirt, it looks like it's got highwayman paintings all over it, those iconic palm trees. And so I'm striking up a conversation with Isaac, and we find 2 paintings that we really like that he has on display. And then come to find out, because we were just learning about the artists then, we didn't know all the different artists, we were just in love with the images. Come to find out that the 2 paintings we wanted, he didn't paint at all. Willie Daniels had given them to him because Willie wasn't going to be able to be at this show, and Willie asked Isaac if he could sell the paintings for him. So here we are buying paintings from Isaac that Willie painted, just kind of like the old days. And I just think that's so funny. And then, of course, we felt guilty for not buying anything from Isaac. So then we had to track him down in another month and buy something of his so that we could enhance our collection with some of his work. I was watching a video last night online that was interviewing Isaac Knight, and I realized that he looked a lot older than he did when I met him. And that's when I kind of realized how long ago these photos were taken. And this is my wife and I with Willie Reagan. If you look at some of his paintings, you see he's got hunt cabins, he's got citrus groves, palm groves, kind of branched out doing some other things. Super nice guy, just willing to spend time with you. And this quote that I found from him that said, hey, we painted on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, frame them up on Thursday, go out and sell them on, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That was how they did their thing. And then this was a painting that someone else took, and my wife and I and James Gibson, with a very nice painting that really struck us, and took us a while to acquire this painting, but that's a whole nother story. It had hung up in the Capitol for a special exhibition, and it's still in its fancy frame. But anyway, James told us all about it, where it was and how he painted it and everything else. And of all the artists, we really spent the most time with Roy and with James. And if I had to choose between the 2, I'd say we spent more time with James, bought more paintings from him, and we became quite good friends with him over the years that we dealt with him. I want to tell you a story about one night we were at a show in Bradenton. We learned that there was a highwayman exhibit in Bradenton. This was a traveling exhibit that came out of the Orange County History Center. All the paintings in it were owned by a collector named Jeff Cook, who's one of the experts here in Florida on the art. And it was interesting. It was a little bit like the Jim Crow era in that they wouldn't allow James to sell his paintings inside. Just like back in the day, they couldn't go in a gallery, so they had to sell on the side of the road, hence the name that Jim Fitch gave them, the Highwaymen. But James everybody wanted to buy from James that night, and he had the back of his Cadillac loaded up with paintings. And so he just told everybody, hey, I can't sell it to you inside, just wait till the show's over and we'll go outside. So when the place was closing down, everybody went out. They're lined up surrounding the back of James's Cadillac. It's a big Escalade. He's pulling out paintings, and it was just like the old days, selling paintings out of the back of the car. One of the paintings that came out of the back of the car that night was one that my wife had actually commissioned him to make, a little Royal Point Sienna. James handed it to my wife in the old style tradition, saying, don't touch it. The oil's still wet. It needs several days to dry, so take good care of it. And there was so much oil, such heavy impasto, as it's called, where the palette knife just kept laying it down, that this painting is almost a sculpture. In fact, I tried to take this angle view to show you that the oil's coming off the painting about 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch. So it's really neat. And our whole house smelled like fresh oil paint for about a month. And James was right. Don't touch it. It's still wet. And that's the way they used to sell the art back in the old days. I found this picture the other day and I had to include it. This is one of the first Highwayman paintings that I acquired before I really knew what they were. And I paid $90 for this, $90. I sold it a couple years later after making a frame for it. I sold it for $400. The last time I saw it was in Arcadia for sale for $800. And I just had to smile. It's a very simple James Gibson. It comes from his kind of monochromatic period where he'd go to a furniture store or a carpet store and see what colors were coming out that year. And he would paint the paintings to match so that it would be an easy sell for someone to put it in their home. But you can't get any more basic than this. Indian River Lagoon in the background, the Barrow Islands, coconut palm, little bit of dock there, and that's what you get for $90. And then this is the last Highwayman painting that my wife and I acquired. Little story behind this one. We had not gone in search of paintings for a while. We thought we had what we needed. And then I had a dream one night of a painting that kind of had this rainbow image, kind of a fire sky scene out on the marsh and all this. And I told Michelle, I said, we gotta get up today. We gotta go check out some Highwayman art. And so we went to Arcadia and I found this painting, which was exactly the image that I had seen in my dream. And I just love this one. It's Livingston Roberts. It's a beautiful marsh scene with birds and the colors. And I just love telling the story about how I saw it in my dream first, and then I went and bought it in Arcadia. So now we're going to take another pause. We've got time for more questions. And then after the questions, I'm going to share some of the other things that my wife and I learned about these artists and their paintings.
Thank you, John. Our next question is, was there a single event or moment that brought these artists to the quote unquote mainstream, such that they are?
Wow. Well, that's a good question. Certainly, Jim Fitch starting to write about them, Gary Monroe doing his research and publishing his book. So Jim Fitch's article came out in '94, started attracting attention. I had heard about them before that, so there was already chatter out there. Gary Monroe's book, I believe, came out 2 years later, and the artists all of a sudden realized that they could go back to work. Longer story than I can tell today, but many of the artists kind of gave up art in the 70s and 80s, and then all of a sudden the 90s come rolling around and everybody wants to buy this art. Now the artists are seeing their old art that they sold for $20 to $25 selling for $2,000 or $3,000. Well, then why don't they get to painting again? And so we had this resurgence, and then you had people like Jeff Cook and others who were bringing people who were organizing these events to showcase the art, bring the artists together, and let those artists thrive again. And they did. And so this resurgence started with Jim Fitch and Gary Monroe's book, and it's just taken off from there.
Thanks, John. We've got several questions about the cost at the time. So mid-century, roughly how much were these paintings going for?
Right. So Mary Ann Carroll describes selling a little 12 by 24. Her bottom dollar was $12. The typical 24 by 36 painting would sell for $20 to $25. Now I'm talking about the James Gibson, the Alfred Hare. Again, Harold Newton and Sam, they were kind of doing their own thing, spending a lot more time on the paintings and probably able to sell them for more. They were making fewer, selling them for more. But the frenzy of painting, where they made as many paintings as they could so that they could make as much money as they could and still sell them inexpensively, what they call sofa size, which is like 24 by 48. Maybe that was a $30 painting. And then there's a story about Al Black, who was a salesman who Mary Ann Carroll's quoted as saying the only paintings he didn't sell were the ones that we didn't give him. He would watch and see what people were interested in. And then there's a quote along the lines of, he would say, "Oh, yes, ma'am, you have good taste. That's the most expensive one." So apparently he would kind of boost those prices up if someone expressed an interest in a particular painting. And they would sell these paintings on the side of the road. But they also did a lot of door-to-door to motels, banks, insurance companies, doctors' offices. James Gibson talks about getting pulled over by the cops, and the cop brought him back to the police station and bought a bunch of paintings from him. So what else do you have, Caitlin?
We've also got some questions about where you find the paintings.
Okay. Right. So you have to be super careful because there's a lot of Highwayman wannabes and Highwayman styles. So if you go on eBay, I'm not saying you couldn't find a great painting there, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're probably going to get ripped off. And you want to really see the image. And so out in Arcadia is really one of the closer places. You can go to some of the shops out there. Again, you've got to be careful in getting quality work for the right price. Or you go over to the East Coast to the Fort Pierce area. You hook up with Roger Lytle, who loaned us a lot of paintings for the exhibit that's on right now, and he's a dealer over there. You got the Bacchus Gallery, often has a set of Highwaymen for sale, other antique and galleries up the East Coast. And occasionally at other antique shops in St. Pete or Tampa, or even here in Sarasota, you might very rarely find one. There was a period of time when Harold Newton actually lived in Bradenton. And so a lot of the people that whose parents bought paintings around this area, those are Harold Newtons, which are really on the high end of the value scale and high end of the quality scale. And so, you know, there were, so there are places you can go, but you really need to do some homework, do some study, and make sure you're getting the real deal and pay the right price for it.
What about yard sales?
Well, it happens. One of the images that you saw earlier in this presentation was a $50 garage sale find. Unfortunately, not by us. But, you know, there are still things out there. That's getting harder and harder to find paintings that people don't know what they are, because the internet allows you to put in that name and hear the whole story. But there are still good things to be found. And in fact, the only reason why I sold that $90 painting for $400, because I was doing a garage sale and a guy walked up and said, "Do you have any highwaymen?" And I thought to myself, there's only one that I would sell. And so I put a number on it and sold it. But Arcadia, I think there's 3 shops right now. Be careful, buy what you love, and don't pay too much for it.
Thanks, John. And last one before we move on to the final section. How many artists are represented in your collection?
Wow, I should have counted them up last night. Probably half of the 26. You know, a collector wants to collect all the different things, all the different scenes, all the different artists. But Michelle and I have collected the images that we love. So we haven't purchased anything because it was a particular artist or because it was a particular value or size. We purchased it because we loved it. And so many of the different artists speak to us. We have some Ellis Buckner paintings. You don't hear a lot about the Buckner brothers, but they saw what was going on. They were picking fruit in the grove, and all of a sudden they could make more money doing paintings. Yeah, we're going to learn how to paint. And so Hezekiah Baker, I really like Hezekiah's stuff. You don't see a lot of Hezekiah Baker, but I do like him. So, all right, we ready to move on?
I think so.
All right, so this last section is called Immersed in Oil. And this represents some of the things that we learned from the artists, from some of the other collectors, from the gallery owners, and just anybody that we could learn from reading all the books and all the articles. And these are some of the things that I've been sharing with people when I have an opportunity to come up and actually walk through the gallery there at the Payne Mansion and see the actual art. And believe me, if you have not seen it, please come and see the art at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. You're going to want to come back a couple of times. So don't wait till the end. Come see it now. And don't forget, on August 21st and 22nd, we're going to have some of the artists paintings for sale. And so actually, why don't you just save your money, come to Marie Selby Botanical Gardens on August 21st and 22nd and buy yourself a painting from the artist right there, like Michelle and I used to like to do. So one of the things that we learned was that the artists could paint very different styles or very different quality. So this is an Alfred Hare that was done on commission. Royal Point Sienna. It's got the dark clouds in the background. The thunderstorm has passed over. It's left with reflective puddles behind. You've got the fishing boat. You've got the net drying rack, because back in the day, all the nets were cotton. You had to dry them every day or they would rot. And you see the little shack off to the right-hand side. This is Alfred Hare doing what he did so well. And this is Alfred Hare painting virtually the same scene very quickly. And so you've still got the rain in the background. You don't have the reflective puddles. You don't have the shack or the boat or the net, but you've got the Royal Point Sienna, and you've basically got the same scene, 2 different levels of quality. You could paint highly skilled, highly detailed. It's like impressionist art, or he could paint another form, which was fast and furious and looked a lot like what you saw when you're driving, you know, 40 miles, when you're speeding 40, 45 miles an hour down the road in Florida back in the day. And here's a quote from Al Black: Alfred could paint as good as he wanted or as fast as he wanted. This Upson board is fascinating to everyone that's never encountered it. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. It was purchased in 4x8 sheets. It cost about $3 at the lumber yard back in the 50s. And it was used for doing built up roofs where they would do tar on the roof. It was used for interior paneling. They had a version that mimicked tile for bathrooms. And also the department stores used it and the theaters used it to create sets and displays and things like that. So it's very inexpensive, a lot like artist board, but much cheaper. And I love looking at the backs of the paintings because you often see the fingerprints of the artist in the oil paint. And it's almost like the genetic work we do at the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens Genetic Lab, and yet it's fingerprints on the back of an art. Here's some advertisements for Upson Board. There's a wonderful little advertising piece that's on display as part of the exhibit that Dr. Berry found online, I believe, and included it in there so that you can see what the Upson board looks like. It's kind of tan in color, and they would shellac the boards, and then they would paint their backgrounds. And this is what made it all happen for them. Artist board was very expensive. Canvas was out of the question and too much work. So you go to the store, you buy a 4x8 sheet, you cut it up into these sizes, and out of a 4x8 sheet of it, in this particular case, you squeeze 7 paintings. A big sofa size one at the end that you maybe get $30, $35 for, 3 of the classic 24x36s, that you then would pay $20, $25 for, and then the smaller 12x24s that might go anywhere from $12 to $15 to $20. And oftentimes you wanted to sell someone one large one and 2 small ones. And that's what you would see basically in any of the little roadside motels over on the east coast of Florida. They'd have a big one over the bed and then 2 little ones kind of juxtaposed next to the door. And that was your furnishings, you know, it reminded you that you were in Florida. And so this is how these artists that didn't have a lot of money could create a lot of painting boards. And the sizes were very important because, again, they're going to paint this stuff one day, frame it, and sell it the next. And so the sizes had to be consistent the way the frames stacked up so that the frames could be stacked on top of one another without impacting the fresh oil paint. Put them in the car, stack them up, and take them down the road. But these are the tools of the trade. A little bit of brushwork on the background to set, you know, the sky and to set the foreground and to get some color on the board. And then the palette knife used to apply most of the detail and in some cases, almost all of the paint. There are examples of paintings in the exhibit that you look at them and it's like 100% palette knife. One that comes to mind is a Harold Newton. And I recall reading where Harold Newton, he had a pocket knife and a spoon that he used to paint, you know, whatever it took to put the paint on the way they wanted to put it on. So I want to take this Livingston Roberts painting and just dissect it for a moment. And so we're going to get closer and closer, but you see these palm fronds, that's not done with a brush, that's done with a palette knife. A little bit of that sky was done with a brush. A little bit of that sand on the beach was done with a brush, but everything else is pretty much palette knife work. And when you look at it up close, you can just see how, you know, Livingston Roberts just went, dee, 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 dee. You know, that made the palm fronds. And then the birds over here on the left, just dee, 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 dee. A little bit of white paint, looks like toothpaste, but it looks like a seagull or a tern, you know? And so, and then a little piece of driftwood, a little bit of palette knife action. But the more you look at these paintings, I mean, you look at them from a distance and it just looks like the landscape. You start looking at them in detail and you see the translucent turquoise color in the wave, just the way a wave looks when the sun's behind it, it's curling in, you know, and you see that foam coming up on the beach, just the way those receding waves leave that little bit of foam and then it all goes down and then another wave brings it back in. And so this painting is kind of in motion. Here's another close-up shot of a James Gibson. This is a real small painting. This one's actually on masonite. Masonite being a denser hardboard, but which most of the artists converted to masonite in the 80s because you couldn't get Upson board anymore. So you start seeing Harold Newton and some of the other artists painting on masonite. And so here you can see brushwork in the background. And I really love this particular brushwork on this particular painting. And then you see the palette knife work, how these little, what looks like a glob of paint, because we're looking at it way too close, is the birds that you see in the other painting. And then the grass out front, you know, just smearing on that paint and adding that depth to it and adding that whole feeling of motion. The wind is blowing, the salt is in the air, You're out on the St., the Indian River, and you're just loving life. And then I included this one. This is a very poor photo of a real beautiful painting, and I apologize that the photo doesn't do it justice, but this is a Chico Wheeler, and it is 100% palette knife. There's no brush that was used for any of this. It was just all palette knife work, just laying on that oil just as heavy as can be. And then one of the things is that we purchased some paintings that had no frames, or the frames were in horrible condition and couldn't be repaired. So then I started making frames, and to make them, I kind of had to learn how they made them. And the frames, for the most part, for most of the artists, were made out of crown molding. And you could buy the crown molding for, a nickel a foot at the lumber yard, maybe 6 or 7 cents for the fancy one that you see in the middle with the notches. And so most of the artists that were painting multiple paintings fast would do the crown molding frames. They would pay a friend to make them. They'd be painting the paintings. The friend would be making the frames. All the frames were the same size for the 24 by 36s, so they could all nestle in together. They used a little miter box like you've got down here. And this crown molding was just, 3-inch crown molding that other people would use to decorate the upper wall of their home. But the artists saw it as a way to provide a frame and a way to really make their paintings pop, and a way to stack them all up so they could sell them. And you'll see that they kind of painted them an off-white, like an antique white. Then they take a dry brush, dip it in a little gold paint, they kind of run it down there. So the one on the left is the most typical frame. The one in the middle is the notched frame. If you get a painting with that, that's like really high end. You can find Harold Newton's with the notched frame. And I believe there are 2 paintings in the exhibit with the notched frame. And then other paintings are in frames that are not crown molding, like the one on the right, where it's just a frame that maybe someone got a used frame and they cut their board to match. And Harold Newton did that a lot, wasn't really bound up with having to do the crown molding frames. And some of the young men who made frames ultimately went on to paint. Johnny Daniels is one example of that. He was making frames for 50 cents a piece and realized he could be painting and make $20. So he converted over from frames to painting. And some of the guys that used to make frames paint now kind of in the highwayman style. And then I threw this photo in because I got obsessed with these paintings, and I started making these miniature easels, and I'd make miniature paintings, and then we'd buy the paintings from the artists, and then the next time we saw them, I would give them back a miniaturized version of the painting that I bought from them. And Roy McClendon seemed tickled by this, and every time I went to see him, he had the little miniature that I had made for him propped up there with all his other stuff. So, hey, if they appreciated it, put a smile on my face, and I was just having fun doing what I do. My wife and I became completely immersed in this art, completely immersed in, driving around the state, looking for the art, meeting the artists, learning about them, and then changing the paintings around our home by the seasons, because there's just so much that they're like windows to the outside world. And so this is my final slide. Florida, as I remember it, captured in oil by talented artists who I'd eventually meet and be reminded of what Florida is all about. And of course, folks, you can still find these scenes in Florida. You can still go to the East Coast and find a beach with a palm tree on it. You can still drive along A1A in certain areas and see nothing but vegetation and the boathouses and the docks. And you can go out in our area and find these same scenes. But you need to remember that back in the 1950s and 1960s, this is all you saw. There was no Disney World. People came here for palm trees and beaches and paradise. And these artists captured that time period. And I don't know if you've noticed, but Florida's changed a little bit in the last couple of years. And so these paintings become a historical record of what things were like and what resonated with the people that were coming here. And if you could only imagine being a tourist, and for a nickel, you could buy a postcard with a palm tree on it, or for $20, you could buy a 24 by 36 painting from this African-American along the side of the road and bring it and put it in your house and remind you of your trip to Florida. Oh my gosh. And what happens is that you start looking at the natural world differently. So I tell you what, everyone tonight, go out and watch the sunset. And that sunset's going to remind you of the paintings. come to Selby Gardens on August 21st and 22nd and buy a painting and bring it home and put it in your house. And that painting is going to inspire you to get outside and enjoy the great outdoors. It's a cycle of life, but it's like bringing old Florida into your home and enriching your life. And at the same time, meeting these artists who struggled against Jim Crow, who struggled against not being able to put their art in a gallery, who had to devise their own framing technique, their own materials to use. And they did so, and they did it seemingly out of nowhere so that we have these images today. But think about it, folks. Some people say that as many as 300,000 paintings were created by this group of artists. But there's 22 million people living in Florida right now. And that's not even counting the tourists. So there aren't enough paintings to go around. So that's why you want to collect some now while you still can. So anyway, we'll open it up for questions. Again, a strong reminder, this is an amazing exhibit with top quality paintings. Some of the best Highwayman paintings you're ever going to see are right now within the walls of the Payne Mansion on the grounds of Maurice Selby Botanical Gardens downtown campus. Don't miss it. Come and see the exhibit, bring your friends, come back again and again, and remember what old Florida is all about. So Caitlin, let's pause there and see what other questions we might have.
Okay. And someone did ask a question in the chat about whether or not any of the artists on the 21st and 22nd will be doing demonstrations. And my understanding is that yes, there will be a few of them that are demonstrating.
Indeed. Yes, they'll have art for sale and they'll be doing demonstrations. We're going to have Marianne Carroll's daughter. We're going to have Curtis Arnett, one of the Hall of Fame artists. We're going to have Isaac Knight. We're going to have Dorothea Hare, Alfred Hare's widow, and Roderick Hare, one of his sons. So this is going to be great. Curtis and Isaac are going to be the live painters that day. And you're really going to enjoy it. So definitely put those days on your calendar and come on out and save your money and maybe take home something nice that reminds you about Florida. So what other questions might we have, Caitlin?
Thank you. We have someone wondering, can you speak a little bit more about Zenobia Johnson's role in organizing the artists?
Yeah, so Zenobia Jefferson, she attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Fisk University was created right after the American Civil War as a place for African Americans to learn how to teach other African Americans. And Zenobia was a student there. Her art teacher was Aaron Douglas. Aaron Douglas was a painter from the Harlem Renaissance. This was such a fortuitous coming together of these artists. And then Zenobia and her husband moved to Fort Pierce. He took a job as a coach. She took a job heading up an art department that didn't exist, as I understand it, before she got there. And she saw the talent in some of her students, namely Alfred Hare. And Bean Bacchus had gone over to Lincoln Park Academy, the school where Zenobia was teaching, and had offered to give some lessons to any of the talented students. And again, this is, totally racially segregated. Lincoln Park Academy is the African-American school. And so Zenobia got, Alfred Hare connected with Bean Bacchus, which, gave Alfred a head start. He realized that, he couldn't spend days painting a painting. He wasn't going to be able to sell a painting for a couple of $100 like Mr. Bacchus could. That's when he come up with the idea of making 20 paintings and selling for $20, because that's how he saw he was going to get rich. And that was his goal. So Zenobia hasn't been talked about as much as Bean, but should always be talked about in the context of these artists. And then Alfred went on to inspire others. Harold Newton inspired Roy and Marianne Carroll. They both had encounters with Harold, and he began to teach them how to paint. And what's amazing is how all these artists were just helping each other. I've never heard anybody say that there were a lot of jealousies or anything. They're working together. They're all selling out there. Bean had kind of asked Alfred to sell outside of Fort Pierce, but of course they were selling all over the East Coast. And again, I mentioned that Harold Newton made his way over to Bradenton and lived in Bradenton for a while. There's one of the paintings that Roger Lytle has on loan to the exhibit. and it's actually a scene of the Manatee River, which I think is a fantastic West Coast scene by Florida Highwaymen. Yeah, okay, what else do we have, Caitlin?
John, we've got a couple questions about did the artist sign their paintings? And then one specifically about there's a painting in the gallery on display by Alfred Hare that signed Freddie. And is that significant?
Right. So when Roger was down for the grand opening, he told me the Freddie story. A gentleman wanted 200 paintings, and he approached James Gibson and Alfred Hare, and he said, make me 100 paintings each, and I'll pay you X amount. Well, Alfred ended up making 120 in the time that James made 80, but Alfred wasn't particularly proud maybe of those. I don't know. He used Freddie as the signature line for those. But to answer your question, and we talked about this a little bit with the volunteers, it's very interesting. Some of the nicer paintings that the artists were very proud of, they would sign them with paint, but a lot of them are signed with probably the tip of the palette knife. Some people say it was a rusty nail. Whatever it was, they actually, engraved into the wet paint. Now, also what would happen is Al Black would take the paintings and he'd take them out to sell them. And he said sometimes that the people buying them wanted to see him sign them. So he would sign them as well. And there are actually paintings out there that have like a Willie Daniels signature and an Al Black signature, because Willie painted it and Al sold it and he put his name on there. There are unsigned paintings, and I've not hesitated to buy a couple of unsigned paintings because I had a hunch who the artist was and I just loved the image so much. I wouldn't do that with anything on canvas, but on Upson, it's a little safer to do. And, then you show them to some of the experts and they say, yeah, that looks like so-and-so, but maybe we'll never know. So look at the signatures on the paintings in the exhibit. You'll see some are engraved with either the tip of the palette knife or a nail or what have you, and others are painted on. They're all fantastic. And the Highwayman artist kind of followed along with what Bean Bacchus did. He used his initials and then his last name, and they did the same thing. And what you'd expect to see as a period looks like a little comma. And if you take a close look, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So when you go to the gallery, take a step back and just look at the art for how it moves you, but then get a little closer and check out some of the details, but not too close. That's why the security guard's on board. And by the way, for the first time ever, we have a work of art loaned from the Smithsonian Institute on exhibit. And so definitely check that out. Museum of African American Culture, I believe, is a division of Smithsonian that's done a collection of Highwayman paintings, and it's an awesome seascape in the North Gallery. So definitely make note of that. Okay, Caitlin, we've got a few more minutes. Do we have any more questions? You're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, we do have a couple more questions. So are most of the paintings in the gallery currently from personal collections or from galleries?
Yes, most of them are from the collection of Roger Lytle, also Alan Azelstein, and the one from the Smithsonian. And so there's a variety of artists represented: Harold Newton, Alfred Hare, Marianne Carroll, Roy McClendon. I think there's a Willie Daniels, maybe a Sam Newton. So those were the artists. And so we have a great assemblage of some of the finest. I mean, the hibiscus paintings that are on exhibit right now are among the finest hibiscus highwayman paintings that are out there. It just doesn't get any better. So that's why you've got to come see the exhibit.
Thanks, Sean. And then we had a question about whether or not this is going to be posted on the website for people to view, or if folks join late, and it will be on the virtual programming page of the website shortly after the presentation, probably next week sometime.
Thank you, Caitlin. Well, look, that wraps it up. It's 1 o'clock. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to thank everyone who's come to the exhibit and then brought friends to see it as well. And if you haven't seen it, come see it. We Dream a World. It's a fantastic exhibit. It's right here at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. And what a perfect place to showcase landscape art, but a botanical garden that envelops history. So this is perfect for who we are and what we do. And I just want to thank everyone who helped me behind the scenes: Wendy Deming, Lynn Bates, Lauren Meyer, Caitlin Whitaker, Dr. David Barry, and everybody else on the Selby team for supporting us today. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much.